On a quiet afternoon in June 1942, the clouds above South Wales parted just long enough for Royal Air Force spotters to see a strange aircraft descending toward their airfield. It wasn't a Spitfire or a Hurricane. Its wings were broader, its nose rounder, and its sound had a deep, mechanical growl unlike anything they'd heard before. For a few moments, no one reacted. The scene felt unreal, almost peaceful, as the fighter glided down and touched the runway with the ease of a bird landing on water. The German pilot inside had no idea he was surrounded by enemies. His name was Oberleutnant Armin Faber, a 21-year-old Luftwaffe ace from Jägerschwader II, one of Germany's elite fighter wings. He had spent the day escorting bombers over the English Channel and engaging British fighters in deadly maneuvers. Somewhere during the chaos of battle, thick clouds and the disorienting spin of combat had robbed him of his bearings. Believing he was heading home to France, he lined up for what he thought was a friendly airfield. When he opened his canopy and saw the British uniforms running toward him, his confidence froze. The planes on the field were Spitfires, not Messerschmitts. The men were wearing RAF blue, not Luftwaffe gray. In that instant, realization hit like a gut punch. He hadn't landed in France. He had just delivered Germany's most advanced fighter, perfectly intact, into enemy hands. At first, the British ground crew could hardly believe their luck. The aircraft sitting before them was the Focke-Wulf 190, known simply as the Butcher Bird. For months, it had been the scourge of the skies. British and American pilots had whispered its name with dread. It was faster than the Spitfire Mark V, more agile in a roll, and packed with cannons so powerful they could shred an Allied plane in seconds. Since its appearance in 1941, the FW-190 had reversed the balance of air power over Western Europe. Pilots who had once survived the Battle of Britain now found themselves outmatched and outgunned. Many described their first encounters with the new German fighter as terrifying. Squadron leader James Edgar Johnson, who would later become Britain's top-scoring ace, wrote that the FW-190 could outroll, outdive, and outshoot anything the Allies had in the air. In just a few months, RAF losses had climbed sharply. Even experienced pilots, men who had fought through the worst days of 1940, were being shot down by an enemy they could barely see, let alone defeat. No captured wreck had survived well enough to reveal its secrets. Whenever a 190 went down, it was usually in flames or shattered beyond recognition. Intelligence officers could only guess at what made the machine so deadly. Some thought it must be lighter. Others believed it used a new kind of fuel injection system. But no one knew for certain until Faber landed on that Welsh runway. Within hours, British intelligence officers swarmed RAF Pembrey. Orders came down from the highest levels to transport the aircraft immediately to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The RAF had finally caught its phantom. Engineers and pilots worked around the clock, photographing every inch of the machine, recording each measurement, and disassembling key components for study. The captured aircraft was designated simply Air Ministry Number 500. When British test pilot Captain Eric Brown took the FW-190 up for the first time, he instantly understood why Allied pilots had been dying. The controls were astonishingly responsive. The aircraft rolled with the flick of a wrist and could change direction faster than any Spitfire. Brown would later say that the plane responded to thought. It was brutally efficient, more machine than art, but a masterpiece of practicality. Its radial BMW 801 engine produced nearly 1,700 horsepower, and its cockpit layout gave the pilot exceptional visibility and control. But it wasn't just about speed or power. The Focke-Wulf's design reflected Germany's philosophy of wartime engineering: rugged, reliable, and built for quick maintenance in the field. Every panel could be removed easily. Every system was designed for a purpose. To the British engineers examining it, the FW-190 seemed less like a fighter plane and more like a statement of industrial perfection. What Faber didn't know was that his mistake would become one of the greatest intelligence gifts of the entire war. This single landing would change Allied tactics, influence aircraft design, and save hundreds of lives. The British had been handed the blueprint to Germany's most dangerous weapon, and soon the Americans would come to study it too. The world's most feared fighter had become an open book, and the Allies were about to read every page. The the secrets inside Germany's greatest fighter. When the captured Focke-Wulf 190 arrived at Farnborough, the air buzzed with anticipation. For months, British engineers had studied fragments of shot-down aircraft, trying to piece together the mystery of why this German machine seemed unstoppable. Now, at last, they had the full picture: wings unbroken, guns intact, engine ready to roar again. Every screw, wire, and gauge was catalogued. The first thing they noticed was how different it was from British fighters. The Spitfire was a work of beauty, a graceful blend of curves and precision. The FW-190, in contrast, was brutally efficient. It wasn't designed to charm the eye, it was built to win battles. The BMW 801 engine at its core was a beast. With 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, it produced 1,700 horsepower, nearly 250 more than the Spitfire Mark V. This engine gave the German fighter its thunderous climb and astonishing acceleration. But that power came with clever engineering. The entire front of the plane was built around a cooling fan system that prevented overheating during low-altitude fights, allowing German pilots to push their engines harder for longer. British test pilots, led by Captain Eric Brown, were stunned. Brown described the controls as silky smooth. Unlike the Spitfire, which required muscle to maneuver at high speeds, the FW-190 seemed to move as soon as the pilot thought about it. In mock dogfights against the Spitfire V, it consistently outrolled its opponent. The German plane could switch direction in a split second, making it impossible to stay behind. But the most terrifying revelation came from its weaponry. The FW-190A3 model that Faber had flown carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 7.92mm machine guns. This meant that a 2-second burst could fill the air with enough explosive firepower to tear apart any Allied plane. All the guns were mounted close to the fuselage, producing a tight concentration of fire that turned dogfights into one-shot duels. For months, RAF pilots had been struggling to understand how their comrades were being shot down so quickly. Now the answer was staring them in the face. The FW-190 wasn't just faster, it was deadlier in every possible way. Yet the more the engineers tested it, the more they began to see cracks beneath the armor of perfection. The powerful radial engine, so dominant at low altitude, began to gasp for air above 20,000 feet. It wasn't built for the thin atmosphere of high-altitude combat. When British test pilots climbed higher, they noticed the engine losing power, temperatures rising, and performance dropping sharply. Here was the opening the Allies had been searching for. The Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine actually performed better at high altitudes. This meant that above 25,000 feet, the balance of power shifted. The British could now fight on their own terms, where their aircraft excelled. Another weakness lay hidden in the very design that made the FW-190 so agile. Its heavy frame and broad wings gave it incredible roll control, but during long turns, that same weight became a liability. In a sustained, horizontal turn fight, a skilled Spitfire pilot could eventually outmaneuver it. The German plane could roll faster, but it couldn't turn tighter. And there was one more flaw, a dangerous one. At speeds above 400 miles per hour, the controls stiffened so much that pilots needed tremendous strength to pull out of dives. Allied engineers realized that if their pilots pursued a FW-190 through a steep dive, they might catch it just as the German pilot struggled to recover. That moment of vulnerability could mean the difference between death and survival. These discoveries were pure gold for Allied intelligence. Within days, Fighter Command began issuing tactical bulletins to squadrons across Britain. They outlined exactly how to fight the FW-190, where to avoid it, and where to strike. Pilots were told never to follow it in rolling maneuvers or low-altitude dives. Instead, they were to lure it higher, force it into turn fights, and exploit its high-speed control issues. But Britain didn't keep this knowledge to itself. Across the Atlantic, the United States Army Air Forces were preparing to enter large-scale combat in Europe. Their pilots would soon face the same enemy. And so, a handful of American test pilots were invited to Farnborough to fly the captured German fighter themselves. Among them was Major Cass Hoff, one of the first Americans to sit in the cockpit of the Butcher Bird. His report would shape how an entire generation of U.S. pilots went to war. The fighter that taught the Allies how to win. Major Cass Hoff could feel the difference the moment he took the controls of the captured Focke-Wulf 190. It wasn't just another fighter, it was a predator. The throttle response was immediate, the roll lightning fast, and every motion felt alive under his hands. When he landed, he wrote a report that spread across every American fighter group preparing to deploy to Europe. His warning was simple and unflinching. Below 20,000 feet, the FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter if the German pilot knows what he's doing. Above 25,000 feet, we have the advantage. Force them high and we win. Let them fight low and we die. That single assessment changed everything. From then on, American fighter tactics evolved overnight. Pilots flying P-47 Thunderbolts and later the sleek, long-range P-51 Mustangs were trained to fight on their own terms. They climbed higher, kept their speed, and struck from above. They learned never to be drawn into the FW-190's deadly low-altitude turns. Instead, they forced German pilots to follow them upward, into the thin air where the BMW 801 engine faltered and Allied power plants thrived. By early 1943, this new doctrine was reshaping the air war. When bomber formations of B-17s and B-24s began crossing into Germany, they were escorted by fighters flying higher and farther than ever before. The Thunderbolt's massive turbocharged engine gave it strength at altitude, while the new P-51, powered by the Merlin engine, could chase the enemy deep into occupied Europe and still return home. These machines carried the lessons of Farnborough in every bolt and rivet. American engineers at Wright Field in Ohio studied the FW-190 with the same intensity the British had shown months earlier. They dissected its controls, mapped its roll characteristics, and even used its cockpit layout to rethink ergonomics in American aircraft. The German plane's tight gun concentration inspired U.S. designers to rethink armament patterns, placing weapons closer to the fuselage to improve accuracy. They modified ailerons on both the P-47 and P-51 to mimic the FW-190's responsiveness, transforming Allied fighters from stiff guardians into agile hunters. But beyond the hardware, something more profound changed: the mindset of the pilots. Before Faber's accidental landing, the FW-190 had been a phantom of fear. Rumors of its invincibility spread through the airfields of Britain and the newly arrived American bases. Pilots whispered that nothing could touch it. That psychological edge was as deadly as its cannons. Yet once the Allies understood its weaknesses, fear gave way to strategy. Training films, illustrated manuals, and lectures circulated through every squadron. Pilots memorized the FW-190's climb rate, turning radius, and dive limitations. They knew exactly when to break off an engagement, when to climb, when to dive, and when to hold fire. For the first time, they could fight the butcher bird not as prey, but as equals. By late 1943, the skies over Europe told a new story. The Spitfire Mark IX, upgraded with a high-altitude Merlin engine, could finally match the FW-190 blow for blow. The American P-47s swept through the upper atmosphere, striking from above with disciplined precision. And the P-51 Mustang, with its unmatched range and speed, became the scourge of the Luftwaffe. German aces noticed the change immediately. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, one of the Luftwaffe's most celebrated FW-190 pilots, wrote in his diary that American and British flyers had clearly studied our aircraft. He admitted with frustration that Allied pilots were no longer making the mistakes that had once cost them dearly. They refused to follow in rolling scissors, avoided low-altitude traps, and used altitude to choke the life from German engines. They have learned, Priller wrote. By 1944, the Allies owned the skies. New FW-190 variants like the Dora 9 tried to overcome the altitude problem with inline engines, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Every improvement Germany introduced was measured against Faber's captured fighter, the aircraft that had become the Allies' benchmark for enemy design. When the war finally ended, aviation historians looked back on that strange day in 1942 and realized its significance. Armin Faber's navigational error had given the Allies more than a fighter. It had given them understanding. Captain Eric Brown, who had flown more captured enemy aircraft than any Allied pilot, later wrote that the FW-190 was our Rosetta Stone for decoding German fighter design. The intelligence gathered from that single aircraft was passed down to thousands of pilots. It shaped training doctrines, inspired new technologies, and changed how engineers thought about performance, balance, and control. Some experts would later estimate that the insights from that one plane saved countless Allied lives. Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in a Canadian prisoner camp. He survived, returned to Germany after the war, and lived quietly until his death in 1976. For years, the Luftwaffe viewed his mistake as shameful, but historians later recognized it as a turning point that altered the air war's entire trajectory. The story of the captured FW-190 is a reminder that even in the most advanced arenas of war, perfection is fragile. Every innovation has its weakness, and every advantage can vanish once the enemy understands it. Superior machines can dominate a battlefield, but superior knowledge wins wars. One confused landing on a cloudy afternoon turned Germany's secret weapon into a lesson for the Allies. A lesson that reshaped the balance of power in the sky and, ultimately, the course of the Second World War.